Now, there's a story in the news this week that looks a lot like it's about golf, but it isn't. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, PIF, is pulling its funding from LIV Golf at the end of this season. More than $5 billion have been invested since 2022. Now, that investment is gone. And the players who took the big guaranteed contracts are suddenly looking incredibly exposed. And the tour that was going to revolutionise the sport is facing a highly uncertain future. Everyone covering this is calling it a Saudi retreat, a humiliation, a failed experiment. But I think that framing misses what's actually interesting here, because golf is not really the story. It's actually the latest example of a story that's playing out in Ottawa, in Washington and in Westminster. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. Here's what I mean. When Canada's Mark Carney became Prime Minister last year, one of the first things he did on his actual first day in office was scrap Canada's consumer carbon tax. The cameras were rolling. He signed a directive and explained it to the country. In his own book, though, published in 2021, Carney had written that meaningful carbon taxes and prices are a cornerstone of any effective climate policy framework. His words, and a considered position from a man who had spent years as UN Special Envoy for Climate Action. And yet, the cornerstone was gone on day one. Carney is far from stupid, and he isn't a hypocrite in any simple sense. He read the room. The cost of living was crushing people. Trump's second-term tariffs were rewriting Canadian politics, and an election was coming. The political cost of keeping that cornerstone had risen above the political cost of dropping it. So it went, and he won. Now let's look at the United States. Last year, Donald Trump sat down with Fox News and said on camera, Medicare, Medicaid, none of that stuff is going to be touched. He was clear and unambiguous about it. Yet within 24 hours, the same man endorsed a budget proposal likely to cut hundreds of billions from Medicaid. Social Security and Medicare together accounted for more than a third of all federal spending in the United States. The trust funds are heading towards insolvency within the next decade. And both parties there have spent years treating them as politically untouchable. Not because the arithmetic works, it really doesn't, but because the political cost of honesty has always felt too high until the pressure changes. And then, as we're beginning to see, the language changes with it. Now, the UK has its own version of all of this. The triple lock on the state pension that guarantees that pensions rise each year by whichever is highest, inflation, wage growth, or 2.5%. It sounds reasonable when you say it like that, but 15 years of compounding means it now costs the equivalent of the combined annual budget for prisons, local roads, fire protection, medical research and street lighting. Yet every party has continually promised to protect it. Nobody has touched it because they fear the backlash that would come. But with defence spending now rising and fiscal pressure building, sources close to the government are now quietly briefing that change may be inevitable. Not because they believe the politics has shifted yet, but because they're trying to make sure they have when the moment comes. Which brings us back to Saudi Arabia. PIF didn't suddenly discover that LIV Golf was losing $100 million a month. Of course, they knew that. What changed is that the pressure elsewhere got heavy enough that they couldn't keep absorbing it. Oil revenues were falling, a widening fiscal deficit was in play, a regional conflict was straining resources. The thing that was strategic became the thing that was now discretionary, and then it was gone. And this is the pattern. The word vital or strategic or committed or cornerstone doesn't describe the value of something. It describes the political cost of removing it. And that cost is always subject to change. We tend to call it hypocrisy when governments reverse their course. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's something more uncomfortable for all of us. Most of the time it's a government finally telling the truth about what it can actually afford. And the more interesting question isn't why they broke the promise. It's what we thought the promise meant in the first place. Because if the last few years have taught us anything, it's this: nothing is untouchable. Some things are just not yet under enough pressure yet. I'm Gavin Megaw. If you find this of interest, please follow and share, and I'll be back soon with more stories behind power and reputation. See you next time.